Welcome back, Yankees fans. Today we have a very special guest on the program. You know him as an analyst on the Yes Network and a best-selling author whose latest book, The 1998 Yankees, is set to be released on May 2nd. It's being hailed as the definitive book on the definitive team, and we're about to take a trip down memory lane to the season of a lifetime. Please welcome Mr. Jack Curry. Welcome
Derek,
back.
Did you sneak some Clash in there for me?
I did. I remember last time you said that would be your walk-up music, so I put that little worm in my mind for next time, and now that's your NYY Recaps intro music.
This is already my favorite interview of the book promoting process because you gave me a little London calling. I love it. Thank you so much. Good
got to set the tone for you, set the mood, get your energy going. So obviously, Yankees off to a kind of a tough start, and we will get to that. We've got a lot of fans that want to talk about this year's team, but you've got a book coming out next week that I can't wait to read. Last time you were on the show, you told me that you were writing this book, and I kind of circled my calendar for when it would come out. So, 1998 Yankees coming out next week. During spring training of 98, Steinbrenner famously asked Joe Torre, has a team ever gone 162-0 before, not realizing they would get closer to that number than any other team. Where were you at that time? That was obviously pre-Yes Network. How were you covering the team, and what were your thoughts as the record grew better and better that year?
Well, when you bring up the 162-0 anecdote, obviously it makes you smile. But it's also a reminder, Derek, that George Steinbrenner was a perfectionist. And George Steinbrenner had a football background as a college football coach. And you can go undefeated in some football seasons. The Miami Dolphins did it. So I think he asked it tongue-in-cheek, but I also think he said that because the expectations were high. And in those days, when you covered spring training with the Yankees, you covered the Yankees, but you also covered George. You had to know where George was at every moment. You had to see what he was doing, because George was a walking headline. If George had an opinion, if George had something to say about the team, you wanted to make sure that you were there to chronicle it. But the thing I remember about that team was how willing some players were to talk about the failure of 97, Derek. And that's why I started the book with the failure of 97. Because sometimes you go to spring training and guys will say, I don't want to talk about last year. It's a new year. Jorge Posada told me it was almost therapeutic to get it out in the open. They let something get away in 97. They didn't want to let it get away in 98.
Yeah, you hear Paul O'Neill mention that on the broadcast all the time, that, he used that for motivation, and he felt like it was almost something universal among the team for everybody who came back, that they felt like they should have won that series in 97.
The clubhouse scene in Cleveland after they lose, and you know the story, O'Neill has the double off the wall. He tumbles his way into second base. Bernie pops up the next pitch, center field. Cleveland wins. Yankees go home. That clubhouse scene was as quiet and as miserable as any I've ever covered. And I've covered 30 years plus of baseball. I've been in losing World Series clubhouses. But as you just noted, Derek, they won in 96, where they were more of a surprise team. Braves were the favorites. The Braves probably should have won that World Series. They were up 2-0. Yankees came back and made sure they didn't. 97, I think the Yankees felt as if they were the favorite. They said, there's another ring out there for us to grab. And when they didn't, I think it was painful, and I think that bled into what drove them in 98.
So Joe Torre obviously was the manager of all these teams, 96, 97, 98, and beyond. A lot of my younger fans probably don't remember Joe Torre. I was hoping you could talk a little bit about his leadership style, how he contributed to the team's success in 98, but also at large in the dynasty.
The thing about Joe, Derek, was that when he came in 1996, there was immediate respect for him because of what he had done on the field. If you look at his managerial record at that point, it was under 500. He got there were a lot of criticism of the Yankees, hiring a retread manager. There was one back page of the Daily News that was Clueless Joe, I believe. But the players respected Joe. The players knew Joe's career, and they respected him even more when they got to know Joe's personality. And the things that that resonated with me about Joe were how soothing he was and how stoic he was. You couldn't tell if the Yankees were winning 10-0 or losing 10-0 by watching Joe in the dugout, and that was intentional. He never wanted his players to think that he was panicking. But in conjunction with that, by being stoic and soothing, when he wanted to get a message across, then it made you jump a little bit, because it's sort of along the lines of that cool uncle you have who you always are getting along with and everything is great, and then one day you cross a line and you remember who the adult in the room is. That's who Joe Torre was, and I know from talking to O'Neill and Cone and Jeter and Posada just how much reverence they had for him. I also think he was helped when he ended up with Don Zimmer in the dugout as a bench coach. I think Don Zimmer helped Torre gamble more as a manager.
So Don Zimmer was a longtime major league manager. I believe he was in baseball for something like 60 plus years. What do you remember about Don?
Loved talking to him. Loved seeing him in the clubhouse. Always had a smile. Always had a great story. I thought the interaction between Zimmer and Jeter was priceless. It was sort of a grandfather-grandson type thing, and nobody could tease Jeter the way Zimmer could. And Paul O'Neill has told this story on Yes, so a lot of your viewers have probably heard it, but Zimmer could also tease O'Neill. And O'Neill, one game, hit a hard line drive or something and came back to the dugout and basically, I'm paraphrasing, but said something along the lines of, "I'm never going to get a hit again. This game's too hard. I can't get a hit." And so Zimmer said, I have a friend who runs a cement mixing company in Ohio. Do you have a resume? I can get your resume to him. And of course, what is O'Neill going to do? He has to burst out laughing. So I think in addition to his baseball knowledge, what I just described is what Zimmer also added.
So another key member of that 98 team that when I think about 98, this is probably the first guy that comes to mind, David Wells. When the Yankees signed David Wells, he was coming off of kind of a rough year with Baltimore. He was 11-14. The ERA was over 5. A lot of Yankees fans, including a very passionate 13-year-old version of me, was questioning the move. 2 years later, throwing a perfect game, and some fans might not remember, he almost threw 2 perfect games that season. What do you remember about David Wells that year, and what do you think made him such a great fit for the Yanks?
Well, it's a very good point for you to bring up those numbers in Baltimore, but I think the thing about Wells that always stood out was how much of a strike thrower he was. I mean, you look at this guy's strikeout to walk ratio in his career. He did not want to walk anybody. He was just pumping strikes in there. And his durability. Wells could throw and throw and throw again and not go on the IL, pitch till he was 44 or 45. And I think the reason that he fit in, Derek, is because he was a Yankee fan growing up. He knew how good that team was. He knew how good of a fit he could be. And after some hiccups, because he and Torre they clashed, and we talk about this in the book, he ends up throwing that perfect game 2 starts after he and Torre locked horns over another start where Torre pulled him out early.
Yeah, for the viewers who don't remember that, and I'm sure you'll detail it in the book, there was a game in Texas where the Yankees had a big lead. David Wells kind of gave it back. Torre went and got him. Wells didn't feel like he should have come out of the game. After the game, Torre made a comment about Wells not possibly being in shape. And again, motivation, the catalyst. And that's one reason I get excited when people kind of get on Judge right now, because I feel like if you challenge a great athlete, that gives them the motivation they need. You know, you watch The Last Dance with Michael Jordan, you watch The Captain, all these guys talk about their motivation. Speaking of motivation, the 98 Yankees had the greatest brawl, in my opinion, that I've ever seen. Yankees versus Orioles. I believe it was sometime in May.
It was 2 games. It was a couple of days, Derek, after the perfect game, actually. It was right on the heels of the perfect game.
So Bernie hits one in the upper deck, and Bernie's somebody we should also talk about because he was a big part of that team. Bernie hits one in the upper deck. Next batter is Tino, who was having a great year at that point. He takes a 98-mile-an-hour fastball to the back, and that kind of sparked one of the greatest brawls ever. Talk about that brawl for me.
I think what Armando Benitez did by hitting Tino Martinez was galvanize a team that didn't need to be galvanized. They were already close. They were already on a mission. They had about a 10 or 11 game lead over the Orioles at that point. And you could see that they were tunnel vision heading toward October. And then suddenly, Armando Benitez throws a punch, and they said, oh, wait a second, no way. And in writing this book, I went back and watched that YouTube video about 15 times, and the Yankees were a pinstripe tidal wave, just going towards the Orioles dugout, trying to get to Armando Benitez because they were not going to let him get away with what happened in him hitting Tino. A couple of guys got close. Nelson and Graham Lloyd threw some crazy haymakers. Darryl Strawberry, I think, did get a shot in from the side, a little bit of a cheap shot where Benitez didn't even see it coming. But they were angry, Derek. And like I said, I think Benitez sparked that team even more. Posada and Tino are quoted throughout my book saying they were just not going to let somebody disrespect them like that. They were not going to let somebody push them around like that. And what happens after the brawl ends, and as you said, people should go to YouTube and check it out. Tim Raines hits a home run. First batter the Yankees had.
Yeah.
If that wasn't an exclamation point on, hey, listen, you had your fun. You tried to push us around. Here's what we're going to do. We're going to kick your butt on the field.
We talked about Steinbrenner earlier. What was his reaction to that brawl?
Steinbrenner was emotional. And again, you can find this on YouTube, but Steinbrenner was very emotional. He said that Benitez could have killed somebody. He's not wrong. You hit somebody in the temple with a 98 or 99 mile per hour fastball, ugly things can happen. And he was also proud of his team. He was proud of the resolve that the Yankees showed and that they stood tall for Tino Martinez and just didn't let themselves get pushed around. And that fit George's personality too. George was a fighter. So when his team did that on that night, I think he was very proud of them.
So another name that comes to mind when I think about 98 is Orlando Hernandez, El Duque. The Yankees had signed him prior to the season. He was a Cuban refugee. There were all these stories about how he was on a raft with all these sharks. Turned out he actually escaped on probably the SS Steinbrenner or something like that. But what do you think of when you think El Duque?
It was still a wooden fishing boat, but they did have an engine, but it was a pretty dilapidated boat. They never saw any sharks, and the weather was sunny. But you're right; it took on a story of its own. El Duque was one of my favorite players to ever cover, Derek, on and off the field. Loved watching him pitch because I'd never seen anyone pitch like that. I'd never seen anyone lift his front knee to almost touching his ear or his cheekbone. I'd never seen anybody throw that kind of assortment of pitches. David Cone threw a lot of pitches, and David Cone liked to mix things up. And I think that they were pitching cousins in a way. But there was just something magical and magnetic about El Duque. And in the beginning, because he was still getting acclimated to New York, he wasn't aware that a pitcher really didn't talk to reporters leading up to his start a couple hours before. So with Jose Cardinal translating, he would talk leading right up to his start, and it was delightful because he would tell us stories about Castro and stories about Cuba, and you could just see how carefree and how liberated this guy felt. So I always say that if you want to have a great team or an extraordinary team, you have to have some players that come out of nowhere. Yeah. And for the Yankees, it was El Duque, Brocious, and Shane Spencer. Because in spring training, if you were asked to define those three players, you would have had Spencer, career minor leaguer. El Duque, maybe a back end of the rotation guy, see if he can help at some point this season. Brocious, just hit 200 in Oakland. Hope he can keep his head above water and play good defense. And then look at who they actually were.
Yeah, Brocious, I think he drove in 98 runs from the number 9 hole that year. And the other guy that you mentioned was Shane Spencer. I think his September was probably the most fun I've ever had watching a player. I mean, Carpenter pretty much outdid that statistically last year during his run, but just Spencer coming out of nowhere with the grand slams and everything, that was magical.
I wrote a lot more about Spencer in this book than I originally planned because when I spoke to him, his story was so captivating. I knew I was going to write a lot about Shane, but when he started telling me the journey that he took and how he went to Venezuela to play winter ball between 97 and 98, and everyone kind of thinks that he was just this guy who fell out of the sky, the hitting adjustments that he made. And then I'll give one quick anecdote from the book. When he finally got called up to the major leagues, he was traveling to Seattle with his wife, his girlfriend who became his wife, from Columbus. He had his wallet stolen in Florida. so he didn't have any ID. They were not going to let him get on the plane. I don't have a Shane Spencer card. I got a Ricky Henderson card here. Spencer's girlfriend reaches into her pocketbook and says, "This is my boyfriend. He's going to the Yankees." That's pre 9/11. He got on the flight to make his major league debut based on a baseball card. So I thought that was a pretty neat little anecdote.
That's an all-time baseball story. Just tells the people out there how great this book is going to be. By the way, you can pre-order this book. It comes out next week. I've already pre-ordered the audio version. I listened to your Paul O'Neill book on a drive to the beach. I plan to do the same thing with the 98 Yankees book. So there's two reasons that I'm looking forward to this book, the book and the beach.
Thanks, Derek. Those audio books that's a lot of you talking. You're in a soundproof booth, and you're trying to make sure that everything is as cohesive and as powerful as you want it to be. So thanks for doing that. I appreciate it.
Yeah. So just as an exercise, you do say that this is the best team. I think the artwork we have is an older version, but the best team in baseball history. Just as an exercise, what teams do you think that you've covered over the years would give the 98 team, the biggest run for their money in a series?
Oh, that's a great question. So it's a team that I've had to cover, because the one that I always think about the Big Red Machine, because you mentioned being 13 before with the 98 Yankees. I was 10, 11 with the Big Red Machine, and that team's lineup, Derek, always stood out for me. Just go up and down the number of all-stars that they put together in that lineup. But what I did in this book, and I had some research help from a couple of our guys at Yes, Jeff Quagliata and James Smythe, and those Big Red Machine teams, their pitching was a little on the lighter side. Yep. Their pitching was kind of league average. So as great as their offense was, and as much as they bulldozed teams, they didn't have the kind of pitching that the Yankees had. You look at the Yankees starting rotation in 98, you had four guys who were either aces or thought they were aces. And then you had Arabu, who, when Wells pitches the perfect game in May, Arabu was the pitcher of the month.
Right.
So you and I think I've talked about that. So I would think back to the Big Red Machine. That would be one team that would stand out to me. I would love to see those teams. I mean, locally, you think about the 86 Mets because it's parochial, and Strawberry played for both of them, and I've interviewed him about that. I mean, your viewers might not want to hear this, but the 18 Red Sox won 108 games. So to me, though, the 98 Yankees were the best. And I know it's subjective, and I know people say you can't pick the best. But we argue about everything else. So why can't we? Why can't we say we think so-and-so was the best and then give our argument to back it up?
Yeah, I think it's fair. I mean, you think about the 98 team, we had two Hall of Famers that had one no vote between them. That's pretty damn good. We got a comment from Louis Penn who says, El Duque served his teammates breakfast before pitching in a playoff game against the Indians. Is that true?
Half true. The Yankees were in Cleveland, and it was a night game. And El Duque was in the team hotel restaurant with some friends, and the restaurant was so backed up that El Duque started bussing tables, and he started cleaning tables to help the staff. Joe Torre was there, and Joe Torre witnessed this, and he pulled El Duque aside, and Joe was a little spooked, and he said, "Do you know how important tonight's game is?" And El Duque said, "I do, but you mentioned the most important word. It's tonight. 2 hours before the game, I will start to get myself ready. Now I'm enjoying some breakfast with my friends." I was like, wow. Okay, there you go, El Duque. You tell him who's boss. And even Posada told me that he was nervous heading into Game 4. And when El Duque showed up in the clubhouse, like just a steely-eyed look, Posada said that he knew they were going to win that game.
So I mentioned before we went live that you may encounter some unhappy Yankees fans in your press run over the next week. So I want to jump ahead to 2023 a little bit. You covered Jeter as a rookie. Anthony Volpe, obviously drawing a lot of comparisons, a young shortstop. Do you see any similarities between the two? Obviously, Volpe's off to an okay start, but maybe not hitting like Jeter would, but it's early.
Yeah, on one hand, you want to say to yourself, let's be fair to the kid. Let's not make these early comparisons. On the other hand, he grew up in New Jersey. He was a first-round pick. He's a starting shortstop for the Yankees at the age of 21, just like Jeter. I think in terms of similarities, I think off the field, Derek, is where it strikes me first. Because Jeter, from day one, was someone in the clubhouse who knew how to handle the media, who wasn't going to gloat or talk about himself or brag. And I think in the early going, and I talked to Volpe myself in spring training, we're seeing that that's who he is as well. He is a kid the focus is going to be on the team. He's not going to be a braggart. He's not going to be somebody who says, look at me. Now, in terms of their overall game, I think we have to let some time elapse. I like what Volpe does at the plate in terms of discipline. I would say right now, since we have this much of Volpe's career and this much of Jeter's career, I would say Volpe seems like a guy who he's gonna work for walks more. That wasn't Jeter's game. Jeter would hit 320 and have a 370 on base percentage, but Jeter's batting average was essentially his on base percentage because he didn't like to walk. The first good pitch Jeter got to see, he was going to hit it. I've seen some aggressiveness with Volpe, but I've also seen Volpe's willingness to be selective, and that's a mature hitting approach. And I also think, Derek, that's a product of the times. Yeah. When I was covering Jeter in his rookie year, Gene Michael talked about on-base percentage, and he wanted guys like Wade Boggs. He wanted guys who worked counts. But now, in the 27 years since then, Anthony Volpe has grown up hearing about on-base percentage and OPS and how important it is to get on base. So I think that stands out for me in terms of his hitting approach. Both very athletic, both good speed. Again, very, very small sample size, but Volpe looks like somebody who's probably going to run more than Jeter. I mean, he had 50 stolen bases in the minor leagues last year.
I think he still hasn't been caught, right?
Yeah, 8 for 8 or 9 for 9. Yep.
Yeah, impressive. So I know you got to get going. So one final question for you. Obviously, the Yankees struggling offensively a little bit. Do you think this is other than guys coming back from injury, do you think this is pretty much the finished product, or do you think that there's help somewhere out there that they can find?
It's a good question. It's rare that you see teams make trades in late April or May. I'm not saying it's never happened. It can happen. They added a Cole Calhoun. I know for Yankee fan purposes, that's probably not somebody who you're rushing to say, oh, this guy is the answer. I think the answer lies within, Derek, and we're going to tackle some of this on our pregame tonight. I thought that Judge said something very interesting last night about swing decisions. The last 4 games the Yankees have played, they've scored 1 run in 27 innings against the 4 opposing starting pitchers. Gausman was great on Sunday. I thought Manoah left some pitches out there on Saturday. Kikuchi definitely left some pitches out there on Friday. And I thought there were some adjustments to be made against Gray last night that they didn't do. So I'm curious to see what the Yankees come out and do in these next couple of games against Minnesota, because I think it's about making smarter decisions. I think we've seen some guys get a little more chase happy and maybe put a little too much pressure on themselves because the offense has been gagging recently.
Jack, thank you so much for joining. Give you a little round of applause there. The book is The 1998 Yankees. It comes out next week. It's available hardcover, paperback, and my choice audio version because, as I mentioned, you can listen to it while you drive to the beach. Jack Curry, everybody. Appreciate it.
Thanks a lot, Derek. I'll talk to you soon.
Take care.
Hey, everybody. If you've made it this far, we thank you. If you'd like to support NYY Recaps, please like and subscribe or pay a visit to our Shopify store for some great Yankees merch. Yes. If you're watching on YouTube, the link is in the description. But if you're listening to the audio version of this podcast, just visit NYYRecaps.shop. If you really want to support NYY Recaps and help keep the show going year after year, join up as a member. It's $5, and members get their names up in lights during each post-game show. We're also on all podcast platforms, Instagram, and Twitch this year. So give us a follow if you use any of those platforms. We're expanding, and we have you to thank for making this such a great community. We'll see you next time.
It is your destiny.
Case closed. Ball game over.
Most impressive.